Hey everyone, my name is Carmen. We'll do intros in a moment, but just wanted to introduce you to our session today, which is called Data Trends in New York City Immigration, a dialogue on ethics and insights. So we're going to be talking not just data trends, but really the sort of juicy ethical questions about what it means to have access to this and how to work with it responsibly. A little bit about us. My name is Carmen Arrow, and I'm a product portfolio manager at Emerson Collective on our technology team. Emerson Collective, if you're not familiar, is a social impact organization that works across distinct but interconnected issue areas, one of which is immigration. And then within those issue areas, we deploy a wide range of tools in kind of aim of that social impact and social good. So we have tools like philanthropy, venture, arts, community building, and in our case, technology and data. So super excited to kind of be here and talking about the work that we're doing. Like I mentioned, I'm a product manager by trade. That means I kind of get my hands dirty trying to make good experiences on screen for folks to interact with information and ideas. But my background in this work is deeply personal. So I grew up in a mixed status family, mixed immigration status. That means that I was a citizen, but folks across my family have different immigration statuses, and that's really guided me through my career. So I worked in immigration legal services, social services. I was a teacher in a heavily immigrant community. And then I transferred over, along the way to technology, really understanding the value of technology to build impact and build capacity in the work being done. At Emerson, I got to work with really talented folks, data scientists and engineers like my colleague Justino, who will introduce himself in a moment. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Justino for an intro.
Thanks, Carmen. My name is Justino Mora. I am a full stack software engineer in the technology team working with Carmen, another incredible technologist. My background is that I am a DACA recipient. I've been working in these intersections of immigration, civic engagement, and technology for over 16 years. I was a community organizer, political strategist, also social media strategists, and have built several immigration tools that have allowed people to contact their representatives to take action on immigration reform. Have also run my own nonprofit on immigration, and have also worked at other nonprofit organizations that focus on immigrant rights. And with that, I'll hand it back to Carmen.
Awesome. Thanks, Justino. So I'm going to go over the agenda for today, and I'll note up front that the first part of this is going to be Justino and I really presenting some of the work and the questions that we dig into, but the real juicy part we're hoping is the Q&A and conversation. But as I'm going through the agenda, if you feel comfortable doing so, we'd love to hear a little bit about you, who you are, what kind of organization you work with, or the sort of lens with which you're approaching the work. As you heard, Justino has worked across the sort of immigration space, coming at it from an engineering perspective. I come at it from like the product and social impact space. And so if we can learn more about folks on the call, I'm sure that would make a really rich experience for everyone. In terms of today's agenda, really 4 parts here. The first, like I mentioned, we're going to just frame the issue and how we think about it in this space. So why immigration? How are we approaching it overall? Then we'll get into the actual data part of this, right? This is Open Data Week. This is the meat of the conversation, going into Executive Office of Immigration Review data, the what, the why, and the how. We'll then go into a demo of data insights that we've created for New York City specifically. So the second section, we'll be talking about the data holistically and then actually seeing a demo that we've been working with. And then lastly, really talking about the challenges and opportunities moving forward in this space. So framing, what's going on in immigration data and tech landscape? What are we noticing? Why are we here? So when we think about immigration data and technology, it's often really lopsided. There's actually not a ton of trust in the space because most of the money that goes into it is on the federal side for immigration enforcement and policing, right? So there's billions of dollars in federal spending that's typically done in search of enforcement and policing immigrant communities. Those investments have included work on things like, surveillance technology, ankle bracelet tracking technology. There is this like robot dog initiative at the border, and then something called CBP-1, which folks might be familiar with, which was an app that was deployed at the border to try to help the asylum process, but had a lot of kind of kinks along the way. Against that backdrop, there's just less attention put on tech for good efforts. So we've seen that there's a lot of folks trying to work on, proving what it means to have technology and immigration. That means, process support for the actual immigration process, the legal process, but also equity efforts. So equity efforts with language, education, employment, or a whole host of things that immigrant communities might need. And then when we think about this space, there's really a few guiding questions for us that help us orient our work. The first is, when the landscape is so polarized, what does it actually mean to be representing data about the people impacted? So I talked a little bit about the, sort of challenges with thinking about immigration technology in this space, but I just want to note, kind of name the elephant in the room. This is, a national conversation. There's national headlines being made about immigration and immigration in New York specifically. So like when we're operating in that political environment, what does it actually mean to be thinking about, data about actual people that are being impacted? So that's something that helps guide our work. Second thing is just how do we do it responsibly, right? What does it mean to use this data? How do we do it responsibly? And then lastly, is it even possible, right? Is it even possible to do that responsibly? And who gets to decide? It's probably not me and Justino, right? It's really a collective of us. It's us in conversation with each other, really learning about the value of this work and how to kind of go forward with it ethically. So we'll transition now over to the EOIR data, the what, the why, and the how of it. So when we're talking about EOIR data, there's a few things that it is and a few things that it isn't. At its core, it is government collected, publicly available data. So this is government collected data. It's collected by the federal government, by an enforcement agency, and then made publicly available. It is not self-identified and self-reported, right? So it is collected through the lens, through the strategies, through the choices that the government makes about people that are about whom they're capturing that data, but it is not reflective of how people might speak about themselves. It's about folks that are in the deportation system, right? So these are inclusive of people who, enter at the Southwest border, lawfully claim asylum, and then are put into the deportation system while they wait their day in court. But it's also inclusive of, folks that are subject to enforcement across the United States through things like ICE raids. So raids by Immigration Customs and Enforcement, or otherwise caught up in the sort of police and deportation systems. It is not a database that is inclusive of all immigrants. One question that we get a lot is, how can we have data about the sort of undocumented community? And our kind of stance on that is that we don't have that and it probably shouldn't exist, right? If we had data on every single person that was undocumented, you can imagine the sort of risk that would pose for the safety of those individuals.
So the other part of this is that this data set is the actual result of advocacy and pressure from the ground. And essentially, we got this data set as a result of a 2016 FOIA Improvement Act, which essentially dictated and required federal government agencies to make this sort of information records available for public inspection and analysis in an electronic format. So this is the key result of, again, grassroots organizing, people asking the government to be transparent and to do the right thing and publish some sort of data that would allow the field to gain a better insight about how the US government is handling deportation proceedings in these sort of cases. As far as what is not, again, one of the things that Carmen mentioned, which I want to highlight, is not reflective of all immigrant needs. There's undocumented people in the country that have never been through or gotten caught by the immigration authorities. So they are truly undocumented. And that's a one example of how this data is not reflective of all immigrant needs. And then what it is, and this is one thing that I'm going to be highlighting more in other slides, is literally a data dump. So the government, in this case, EOIR, is required by law to publish this information on a monthly basis. But they're not required to put it in a nicely formatted way. They're not required to make it easy for people to know what the data consists of, how it is structured, and what are the different key codes. Like what does each CSV file represent? So most likely what they do is they just go ahead and click file export, and that's essentially what we get. And what it is not, again, is not a clean and easy to understand data set. Again, like this data set contains close to 100 CSV files, probably 4 or 5 Word document files. And it's really difficult to understand because, again, there's no easy way to connect one file to another.
So when we think about what it is, that's sort of like trade-offs, what we can glean from it, what we can, the big question is why even use it? And for us, we think about it in a few ways. So the first is that it's just a huge data set, right? This data set is one of the largest data sets on immigrant communities across the United States. And because of that, it's super powerful as a proxy for what's going on across communities. And so what that means, right, is that we know that people tend to go where there are other people like them. And so when we see the demographic information that we'll go into in a little bit, we start to see what's really going on across the country at large. It's also an act of reclaiming publicly available data. So one thing that I'll note here, right, we come at this from like a sort of ethical data and technology lens, and consent is something that's super important to us when we think about data collection. And this is not a data set that was consensually collected by parties of equal power, right? This was a government data set. A data set collected by the government with people that they're trying to deport, right? And there's just an inherent power balance there. But we recognize that this data set exists, it's already out there. The government has access to it and uses it within that deportation system. And so what does it mean to now reclaim that data and use it for sort of social impact purposes? And lastly, it's timely, right? So traditionally, if you wanted to know what's going on in immigration, you would rely on, let's say, the census, right? The census comes out every 10 years, right? A little bit hard to understand changing trends with that. Or maybe the American Community Survey, which comes out every few. And so EOIR, which we'll get into more, is released monthly. And so while it's not real-time data, it's as close as real-time that we have. And so it's really powerful in understanding, shifts much more quickly.
So I'm going to be quickly talking about how does the EOR data work. And Carmen mentioned something really important, which is this information gets published monthly. Again, by law, the EOIR is supposed to publish this information, but they're not required to publish it on a certain date of the month. Thus, what we know is that we'll know that they're going to publish the April data, but we won't know exactly when. So what we have to do is either build automated systems that automatically do that for us, go check the website on a daily basis, as an example, and then check if there is new data. So this data is, again, a very large data set. I mentioned that it has more than 100 CSV files, and some CSV files may contain 10 million rows, or even some of them 20 or even 30 million rows. And for instance, for our use case, we're extracting data from about 8 CSV files. So we have only scratched the surface of the entire data set. Again, 8 CSV files that we're currently relying on versus 100 CSV files in the entire data set. And again, I mentioned that they're mostly CSV files, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the technical challenges that came about essentially extracting data from these CSV files. And the other point that I want to mention is that this data should contain all historical case data, meaning that we actually have found records going back to the 1950s. And one of the things that has happened in the past is that EOIR has been found not publishing all data. So in the past, for instance, in 2019, under the Trump administration, EOIR was found that for about a year, they were not publishing certain files. Some of the files, CSV files, were not being released in the data set, and they were missing millions of rows from certain CSV files. And actually, as well, in the last year that in the last year or so that we have been working with this data set, we have actually found some similar patterns. There's been some missing data from some of these CSV files, but we don't know exactly why this information is being removed from these CSV files. So what makes the data hard to process? So one of those things that I mentioned was that this data is released at irregular intervals. So one of the things that we built a very sophisticated ETL pipelines that essentially they're automated essentially data pipelines that allow for the retrieval, the extraction of this data for performing a lot of transformations, and then making this data available for use in your dashboard. So we built this system that automatically does that for us. So we don't have to worry about EYR publishing this in irregular intervals. We completely automated that part of the process. The second piece is that it uses what I define as old file versions, CSV file versions. So what does that mean? It means that these CSV files are encoded or CP1252 encoded. And what does that mean? It just means that is the default encoding format for in many Microsoft applications. And that's how these CSV files were encoded. So when we first built the initial pipeline, it meant that because they were encoded in that way, we had to do a trial and error to be able to get our code to work correctly. Because I remember there were many times when we would be able to extract, let's say, 10 million rows from a specific CSV file, and then the system would just crash. And that brings me to the second point, which is there is corrupted data. So there's a lot of corrupted data in these CSV files, and that's another edge case that we had to account for and ensure that whenever we're processing these CSV files, our code is able to manage these corrupted data, either throw them away completely because the data is completely, is not useful to keep, or find other ways to go around those corruptions in the CSV files. And then the data is also messy. I'll talk about some of those examples of how the data is messy. But for instance, there are many CSV files that have very similar names. And that just makes it confusing because we don't know if, let's assume there's two CSV files that have codes of languages. And we don't know which file. At first, we didn't know which of those files the government was using as the default, as the main file to know what all the languages in the world are. Another messy part of this data is that sometimes we might find information in certain columns that it shouldn't be there. So sometimes we saw phone numbers in the zip code column. Sometimes we saw zip codes in the state column for some specific CSV files. So that's the kind of messiness that we see in this data set. And as we mentioned, that EYR, again, like they don't put a lot of emphasis in ensuring that this information is very clean. That's something that we have to take into account for. And then the last piece that I want to highlight is it's really extensive and hard to decipher. I call it a hard to decipher data code key. What that means is that the government also published a PDF file with the names of all the CSV files, with the column names in each of those CSV files and what they represent. But it's a very large file. It's kind of cryptic, so you have to know the immigration lingo, the terminology to be able to understand what they mean. And thus, that might give you a better idea on how these files are interconnected, the relationship between of these files. And I'll move on to the next slide. And what makes the data hard to share? One of them is ethics. As I mentioned, we are a mighty team of technologists. We're socially conscious, and we want to make sure that we protect people's privacy and that we create tools for social change. So one of the things that we decided to do, knowing the power of this data set, is that we also limited the results in our dashboard. And Carmen is going to be providing a demo of our platform. And so what we did was, for certain cases, you can go very specific on the filtering. So you can say, hey, a dashboard, show me all the cases for people. I'm just going to use New York as an example. Show me all the cases for the people living in New York. I want to filter by nationality. Let's just choose, I'm just going to use example, Guatemala as an example, language, let's say Spanish, and maybe for age group, people that are underage. And then you can get very specific. And we realized, hey, maybe at some point we don't want to return very specific results. So we also limit those results in order to honor privacy and make it difficult for bad actors to know who in their neighborhood, in their town, might be in this data set. And then the second piece is an access system. And that means that the way to access these visualizations is by having an account, a login system. And this is really important because we need to build trust. One of the things that we've learned in the immigration ecosystem, in the immigration sector over the last couple of years, is that we need to be able to build trust. There's been many instances where government and other nonprofits or foundations have worked with immigrant rights organizations, and they've done or built systems where those systems and tools sometimes end up doing more harm. And this is one of the ways that we've been able to build trust from the field in the power and the usefulness of this tool.
So like Justino kind of mentioned, we're going to get into a demo now, and this will be specific to what's kind of going on in New York. So this is basically the dashboard that our team has been working on to be able to visualize this data in a meaningful way. And what you'll see here is that this data set is reflective back to 2016. So Justino mentioned the data set goes back before then, right? There's some cases back to like the 1950s. But for the purposes of our data work, we really started at that January 2016 line and have been going forward to the present. So just to kind of anchor us, orient us here on the map, we'll see that since January 1st, 2016, through the latest data from the government, there are about 5.3 million people that have been in this deportation court system. It's a lot of people. And you'll see here we have an overview trend, and it should pass kind of a sense check, right? So 2016 to 2018, there was sort of a lot of folks kind of entering the system. It dips down during COVID, and then it really starts to kind of go up and spike. Right? If you're in New York, you're following the immigration headlines, this probably, again, passes a sense check of your understanding of what's going on. So that's the first part of this. The second part of this is actually this overall map of the United States. So I'm going to zoom us out and look at the map as a whole. This tells us where people actually live, right? So not exact addresses, but cities that we've determined based off of the zip codes in this data set. And we've created a visualization on where folks are ending up across the United States. So that's kind of our orientation to this data. But for New York City, we can actually go ahead and put in a filter here. So I'm going to filter down to New York City. And you'll see here that New York comes up as its own dot, but we actually have the information available by borough, right? So for the purposes of this demo, I'll show you that we have Bronx, we have Queens, Staten Island's down here, but we're going to go ahead and click on Brooklyn since that's where most of the need is. When I click on Brooklyn, right, now I see those numbers change, and it's about 110,000 people currently in Brooklyn that have ended up in this data set throughout this time period. And again, this overview trend map is super similar to what we saw nationwide. It sort of peaks in 2018, it goes back down, and then it's really, 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 really high up until about the end of last year, and then it's dipped down a bit since that historic high. So as we go down here, I'm going to show you some of the information that we've exposed from the data set. So like Justino mentioned, there are a ton of CSV files that we could pull from, but where we started was demographic information, right? What we heard is, hey, we don't know where people are going, we don't know who people are, we don't know how to support them, how can we get smarter about that? And so when I scroll down, you'll see some demographic information that we've pulled from the data set. One of those pieces of demographic information is nationality. So you'll see that, again, within Brooklyn, within that time, most folks are from China, right? About 14,000 plus people. And a close second is Ecuador. And then you have Russia, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Venezuela, Haiti, Guatemala, Bangladesh, round out that top 10. That's the nationality, but then we have the language data, right? So this is data information that's been collected. Even though China is the top nationality, the top language represented is Spanish in the data set. We have information on gender as well, right? So we have male, female, and not indicated. Again, this goes to the fact that it's a government collected data set. It's not how people are self-reporting. This is really more of a sex marker than a gender marker, but that's how it's displaying in the data. And then we have information on age group. So you'll see there's really a lot of folks in that 22 to 65-year-old range, very few over 65, but also a lot under 13. So this gives us kind of an anchoring of who is in the data set. And then we can go one step further. We can actually see trends over time, right? So if I really wanted to hone in on the China nationality, I could go ahead and do that and see this chart like that. But let's say, okay, I'm looking at age group let's say I work with kids, right? I was an educator, that's something that I've always cared about. Let's change this data set a little bit. I want to look at kids who are under the age of 13. And you'll see here the data shifts a lot, right? So instead of China as the largest represented nationality, it doesn't even break really the top 10, right? We have Ecuador as the top country of origin, followed by Russia, Venezuela, Uzbekistan, Colombia. And you see a similar thing with the language, right? We'll see Spanish far more represented, and then down to Russian, Uzbek, English, Creole, so on and so forth. Again, right, the language here is represented as Georgian Soviet Republic. That is how the government is representing it, and that's what we're reflecting back in this database. So, right, I'm looking at kids under the age of 13, getting a little bit better sense of who they are within that Brooklyn context. So that's one piece of it, demographics. This is a deportation court data set. And what that means is that we also have a lot of information about someone's legal needs. And one thing that I like to note here is that there's sometimes a conception that legal data is only helpful for legal practitioners. And that's true, right? It is helpful for legal practitioners, but it's also helpful for understanding the holistic needs someone might be facing. So if I go back to like that under 13, let's say educator example or working with kids, what does it do to your sort of services, to your knowledge of a community to know that not only is the population heavily under 13, but most of them don't have attorneys, right? They don't have attorneys and they have upcoming court hearings. Um, that's stressful, right? That's a really, really, really big stressor on a kid, even if they have parents, with them. If you're concerned about like education outcomes or children's health, these are the type of things that you can start to layer together to really get a sense of what someone's like overall needs might be given the data that we have. And so we're really excited to, talk about that in this context. So with that, I'm going to go over to some of the use cases that we've seen emerge. And just to kind of level set, we have a couple more slides, and then we're really going to just open this up for conversation, which is what we're really excited about. And at that point, I've seen some questions come into the chat. We'll go ahead and address them at that time as well. So that was the demo. That's how we're visualizing the data. That's how we're trying to talk about it. But we really want to flag here just one step out, zooming out, how we think about the use cases for inclusion with this data set. The first here is just illuminating specific needs and challenges and cultural backgrounds. You can't, you don't know what you don't know, and you can't serve based off of information that you don't know. And so, being able to have access, at the borough level of New York or at the sort of language and nationality background, it just helps identify one step closer to what those core needs might be. It also helps, in our opinion, right, create opportunities for community engagement, co-design, and trust building. If you are able to actually see who is in the community and you realize that like, okay, we're actually not serving a ton of people from these backgrounds, maybe that opens up a question of how can we do outreach more? How can we engage with, community leaders? How can we bring folks in to co-design, build trust, and let people know that like, hey, we're really trying to meet people where they are, we're really trying to understand them and go from there. And then lastly, right, it's sort of a support mechanism for strategic planning longer term. Right? There's, again, a lot of headlines about resource allocation, right? How we get resources to the right places, how we sort of ensure that needs are being met. And we think and we hope this can be one of those tools on that path. Also helping for like funding, policy development, right? Really understanding the numbers, which again are reflective of real people with real stories, but understanding that within the sort of policy context. And then program success measurement, right? If you're committed to understanding people's needs, creating opportunities for that co-design and engagement, can you then sort of measure your program success against actual trends in the community? So those are some of the things that we've thought about as sort of ways of doing this for social impact. But, this talk is about the sort of ethics of it. Just because we hope that there are good ways to use this doesn't mean there aren't bad ways to use this. And so I'm going to turn it over to Justino, who will talk about some of the things that keep us up at night.
Yeah, so there are several things that keep us up at night. I'm going to focus on three of them, and I'll provide examples for each one of these points. So the first one is enforcement and surveillance. So as we think about creating tools for social change, we also have to think about ways that these tools can be used maliciously, and we have to build ways to prevent malicious and bad actors from using these potential tools. This is one of those risk of misuse. We wouldn't want either all specific government agencies in the United States, let's say CBP, or outside foreign entities from using this data as a way to target specific individuals. One important thing that I want to emphasize about the UIR dataset is that the government does remove certain PII from the data, such as people's names or A numbers. And just for some context for those people that might not be familiar with what an A number is a 9-digit number that is given to all immigrants in the United States who go through the immigration system, and it's a unique identifier. So think of it as the social security number, but it's just a way to identify people within the immigration system. So those are things that get removed by the federal government. And so this information that gets published doesn't have any PII. But again, as Carmen mentioned and showed through the demo, we also don't want to make it easy to, for malicious actors to use a platform in such a way that I would allow them to determine if someone within a specific community or zip code or city, might be going through deportation proceedings. Another one is, potential risk of misuse, fueling anti-immigrant narrative. So what does that look like? I'll provide two examples. So there's this hateful news entity called Breitbart News. A couple of years ago, they would take specific information or data sets or reports from specific nonprofit organizations, and they would misconstrue those facts. They would publish either lies, flat out lies about those specific demographics. So we wouldn't want those sort of bad actors to just use the dashboard and say, oh, this specific group of immigrants from the Central America or South America are going to this specific state in the United States, and then create these hateful anti-immigrant narratives for whatever goals that they have. And then the third one is xenophobic violence and doxing. And this is another example is I have also a lot of friends who are immigrant rights activists, and in years past, their information has been leaked. There's been profiles created about them in places like 4chan, and these are really hateful platforms, channels where people want to expose certain personal information about activists. And that's another potential risk of misuse. But the great thing is that we've been very thoughtful about these potential risks and done everything that we can to prevent this sort of malicious actors from using this platform.
So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and just sort of revisit those guiding questions and open up to Q&A. I'll note the questions that are coming through the chat. But we're also going to, traditionally Q&A, you ask us questions, but we really want to ask you questions. We are so interested in this topic and making sure that, voices are heard on it. And the things that we want to just sort of pose to people on the call here is based on what we've talked about, based on your own experiences, based on the communities that you serve. What do you think, right? How can we ensure that this data is used responsibly while protecting immigrant communities? How do we balance the benefits and the risks? Is it even worth it? And then what's your use case, right? Like, how do you think this data can be used for the communities that you work with or layer with other New York City data? I've seen a lot of folks talk about in the chat, where they're coming from, the type of work that they're doing. And so I'd really, really love to hear for that.
Oh, Carmen, would you like me to stop the recording?
Oh yeah, thank you. But we're going to stop the recording and just try to open up that conversation here.